They thought this was a private family collapse until one message, one silence, and one name exposed a chain of secrets that ended in blood, betrayal, and a question Hollywood still refuses to answer. The quiet streets of Brentwood have seen their share of celebrity comings and goings, but nothing prepared this neighborhood for what unfolded just days before the world found out. On the surface, it looked like another private family emergency, sirens in the distance, flashing lights briefly cutting through manicured hedges, then silence. But inside one house, a story was already unraveling that would soon expose how loyalty, fear, and secrecy can quietly rot even the most powerful families from the inside. This matters because what happened here wasn't sudden, and it wasn't random. It was the result of decisions made in silence, warnings ignored, and a belief that problems could be controlled if they stayed hidden long enough. At the center of it all was Romy Reiner, standing frozen inside the home she grew up in, staring at a reality she was never supposed to see. Her parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, lay motionless. No forced entry, no chaos at first glance, just an unbearable stillness that told her, instantly, that her life had split into before and after. When police arrived and confirmed the worst, Romy collapsed where she stood, her body giving out before her mind could catch up. Rushed to the hospital, shaking and barely conscious. She whispered something that would later become impossible to ignore. Catch Nick. Don't let him get away. Those weren't the words of someone guessing. They were the words of someone who already knew where the truth was pointing. And that's where this story truly begins, not with a crime scene, but with a family that had been quietly fracturing for months while everyone else saw smiles, photos, and carefully maintained normalcy. Because long before December 14th, something had shifted inside the Reiner household. Friends noticed it first. Conversations cut short. Missed calls. A tension no one could quite name. And at the center of that tension was Nick Reiner, the once charismatic son whose struggles were always handled behind closed doors. For years, Rob had been the one smoothing things over, cleaning up messes, making calls, protecting Nick from consequences the world never saw. But protection has a breaking point. According to people close to the family, Rob had reached his. He wasn't angry anymore. He was tired. And when exhaustion replaces anger, people start making decisions they believe are necessary, not kind. That's what makes this story unsettling. There were no villains announcing themselves. No dramatic blow-ups in public. Just quiet choices, private messages, and a growing sense that something had to be done before everything fell apart. On the afternoon of December 14th, Romy felt it before she knew it. Her parents weren't answering their phones. Not texts, not calls. The kind of silence that doesn't feel accidental. As daylight faded, dread set in. The kind that sits heavy in your chest and doesn't leave. She drove to the house because part of her already knew she couldn't stay away. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, relationships were already imploding. Rob had sent a message days earlier that would later take on terrifying way to clean break, final and cold, cutting someone out completely. What Rob didn't realize was that silence can feel like a threat to someone who already feels cornered. And Nick had been unraveling. People around him noticed paranoia creeping in. Missed sleep, constant checking over his shoulder, a sense that someone close to him had turned. By the time Romy stepped through that front door, the damage was already done. And while the public would later rush to simplify what happened into headlines and labels, the truth was far more uncomfortable. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a slow collapse hidden in plain sight. And the question that refuses to go away is this: when you try to erase a problem instead of confronting it, what happens when the problem realizes it's being erased? What most people didn't see was how fast everything began to fracture once Rob Reiner stopped playing the role of protector and started acting like someone preparing for an ending. According to multiple people close to the family, the shift was subtle at first: missed calls, unanswered texts, long pauses where conversations used to flow. Rob wasn't angry anymore, and that change unsettled everyone around him. Anger can be argued with. Silence can't. He began distancing himself from Nick in ways that felt deliberate, almost procedural. Old photos vanished from his phone. Mutual contacts stopped hearing from him. It was as if Rob wasn't just stepping back, he was erasing evidence of a connection that had defined years of his life. That's when Nick started to spiral. Friends noticed he became increasingly paranoid, convinced something was happening behind his back. He'd show up at random places in Los Angeles, eyes darting, checking his phone every few seconds, asking the same question in different ways. Have you talked to Rob? The more Rob withdrew, the more Nick unraveled. And this is where the story turns uncomfortable, because Rob wasn't just cutting ties. He was moving quietly, intentionally, and with purpose. People later claimed had begun digging into things Nick had tried to bury: old messages, deleted files, conversations that were never meant to resurface. Some believe Rob uncovered something serious, something that reframed years of loyalty as manipulation. Others say Rob didn't need new information at all. He already knew enough. What mattered was control. Because around this time, Rob began referring to the situation with a phrase that would later take on chilling meaning: a clean slate. To outsiders, it sounded like healing. To Nick, it sounded like erasure. He tried everything to break through the silence. Calls, texts, showing up unannounced. Each attempt met the same response: nothing. That silence wasn't indifference. It was a warning, and Nick felt it. His behavior grew erratic. He stopped sleeping, canceled meetings, spoke in half sentences that hinted at betrayal. One insider said Nick believed Rob wasn't just abandoning him, he was setting him up. Meanwhile, Rob's calm became unnerving. He wasn't reacting publicly. He wasn't defending himself. He vanished from social circles entirely, skipping events he'd never miss, declining interviews, avoiding anyone who might ask questions. And that absence became its own kind of statement. Then the internet found something it couldn't ignore. An old clip resurfaced from a charity event months earlier. Rob and Nick laughing side by side, looking relaxed, almost happy. But in the video, Rob glances at the camera and says, "One day, people will know who you really are." At the time, it sounded like a joke. Now, it felt like a warning. The clip spread fast, igniting speculation that Rob had been planning this break long before anyone realized. When Romy Reiner finally addressed the growing storm, her words only deepened the mystery. Her voice shook as she spoke about both men, choosing each word carefully. She didn't accuse. She didn't defend. But she said something that changed how people viewed the entire fallout. Rob wasn't just angry, she said. He was scared. That single sentence reframed everything. Scared of what? Scared of who? And why did fear, not rage, drive him to erase someone had protected for years? By this point, the narrative had shifted. This wasn't a simple family rift. It was a collision of secrets, guilt, and two people who believed they were preventing disaster in very different ways. Rob believed distance was safety. Nick believed distance was betrayal. And neither realized how dangerous that misunderstanding was becoming. Because while Rob thought silence would end the chaos, it was doing the opposite. It was feeding it. And the closer Rob moved toward what he believed was resolution, the more Nick felt cornered. And when someone already unraveling feels trapped, they don't always run. Sometimes they strike. By the time anyone realized Rob Reiner wasn't just distancing himself, but actively planning something, it was already too late to stop it. What appeared on the surface as calm, even compassion, was actually a carefully constructed solution he believed would finally end years of chaos. Behind closed doors, Rob had started making quiet calls, first to professionals, then to lawyers, and finally to a private recovery facility far from Los Angeles. To those he confided in, it sounded like concern. Nick needed help, space, structure, somewhere quiet where he couldn't hurt himself or anyone else. Rob spoke in measured tones, describing it as a reset, a fresh beginning, a way to protect the family and give Nick a chance to heal without the pressure of public scrutiny. But there was one detail Rob never said out loud. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a break. It was an ending. The plan wasn't just to help Nick recover, it was to remove him from their lives completely. And that distinction mattered more than Rob realized. Romy would later admit that when her father hinted at arrangements, she assumed he meant therapy, not exile. At the time, it felt like relief. Finally, something was being done. But Nick sensed it immediately. The tone had changed. Rob was too calm, too prepared, like someone who had already made peace with a decision Nick hadn't agreed to yet. According to people close to them, Nick began noticing small things that didn't add up: documents on Rob's desk that disappeared too quickly, a phone call that ended when Nick entered the room, a flight itinerary that didn't have a return date. What Rob believed was discretion, Nick experienced as deception. And the more pieces Nick put together, the more trapped he felt. One source said Nick believed Rob wasn't saving him, he was burying him. That belief changed everything. The dynamic between them shifted from tension to silent warfare. Rob kept playing the role of calm reassurance, explaining the program as support, promising discretion, telling Nick this was about healing. But Nick heard something else in his voice. Finality. Like Rob had already decided who Nick was and what needed to be done with him. That's when Nick started watching instead of arguing. He stopped pushing back, stopped questioning details. To Rob, it looked like acceptance. In reality, it was calculation. Nick began looking for proof. And he found it. Late one night, while Rob believed everything was under control, Nick uncovered the documents, messages, bookings, confirmations. The plan was real. The destination was remote. The exit was one way. Whatever restraint Nick had left shattered in that moment. Because to him, this wasn't help. It was betrayal by the one person who was supposed to protect him no matter what. Neighbors would later recall raised voices that didn't sound explosive, just heavy, exhausted, and raw. Arguments that felt more like confessions than fights. And then, silence again. Rob believed the storm had passed. He even cooked dinner that night, trying to normalize the moment, talking about fresh starts and peace. He didn't see what Romy noticed, a strange stillness in Nick, a calm that didn't feel relieved, just resolved. She later said something about Nick felt off, like had already made a decision and was just waiting. Rob spent the rest of the evening finalizing details, reviewing documents, checking times. He thought he was ending the nightmare. What he didn't know was that Nick had already crossed his own point of no return. To Nick, the plan wasn't a solution. It was a threat. And once someone believes their life is being erased without consent, rational thinking gives way to survival mode. That night didn't feel chaotic at first. It felt inevitable. And as Brentwood slept, unaware of what was building behind those walls, two people who once trusted each other completely were moving toward a collision neither of them would survive unchanged. The night everything broke didn't arrive with chaos, it arrived with a calm so unnatural it should have been a warning. Inside the Reiner home, the air felt heavy, as if every unspoken word from the past months had gathered in one place. Rob believed the hardest part was over. He thought Nick had accepted the plan, that the resistance had burned itself out, and that tomorrow would finally bring quiet. He spoke softly that evening, almost gently, framing what was coming as a chance to reset, to start over somewhere safe. To Rob, this was mercy. To Nick, it sounded like goodbye. People who later studied the timeline would point out how Nick barely spoke that night, how he nodded instead of arguing, how his silence was mistaken for agreement. But silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it means someone has stopped asking for permission. At some point that evening, Nick disappeared for a few hours without explanation. Rob didn't stop him. He didn't question it. He assumed space was part of acceptance. When Nick returned, something had shifted. His expression was flat, focused, almost distant. Romy would later say she remembered feeling uneasy, sensing something was wrong, but not knowing how to name it. She sent a message to Rob later that night, saying Nick felt different, like had already made up his mind about something. Rob didn't see it as a warning. He saw it as nerves before a big change. While Nick sat quietly, Rob reviewed the final details one last time: the travel documents, the clinic information, the schedule. Everything was arranged. He believed control meant safety. What he didn't know was that Nick had already seen everything. The proof, the messages, the one-way nature of the plan. And in Nick's mind, that discovery rewrote the entire relationship. This wasn't help. It was abandonment dressed up as concern. Neighbors would later report hearing voices not screaming, but low, strained arguing that carried the weight of years of resentment and fear. Then a crash. Then silence. By morning, the stillness had turned deadly. When Romy returned to the house after her parents stopped answering their phones, she felt it immediately. The door unlocked. The air wrong. The kind of quiet that makes your body react before your brain can. She called out. No answer. And then she saw them. Rob and Michelle, motionless. The life she knew ended in that moment. Police would later confirm there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever did this was someone the family trusted. The investigation moved fast after that. Nick wasn't missing. He wasn't on the run. He was found sitting alone in a nearby hotel room, calm, detached, surrounded by personal items as if he'd stepped out of time. He didn't resist arrest, didn't argue, didn't explain. Blood evidence connected him to the scene, but his expression never changed. When Romy was told her brother had been taken into custody, she didn't scream. She whispered, he wouldn't hurt them, even as part of her already knew the truth was far more complicated. As details emerged, deleted messages, voice recordings, documents, the narrative shifted again. This wasn't a crime born from rage alone. It was the final result of fear, silence, and a plan that went wrong the moment it stopped being honest. Rob had believed he was preventing disaster. Nick believed he was being erased. And somewhere between those two beliefs, everything collapsed. As the media rushed to assign blame and simplify the story into headlines, one truth became impossible to ignore. This tragedy wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about everything that happened quietly before it, the warnings missed, the conversations avoided, and the belief that control could replace understanding. And as the city demanded answers, one question refused to fade. If the truth had been spoken sooner, would anyone still be alive today? In the end, the Reiner story resists the kind of clean conclusions people crave, because it was never about a single bad decision or one broken person. It was about what happens when fear is mistaken for control, when love turns into management, and when silence is used as a solution instead of honesty. Rob believed distance would save his family. Nick believed distance meant he was being erased. Romy was left standing between those two beliefs, carrying the weight of truths revealed far too late. What makes this story matter is not just the tragedy itself, but how familiar the pattern is: problems hidden to protect reputations, warning signs softened to avoid conflict, and the dangerous assumption that good intentions guarantee safe outcomes. Even now, unanswered questions remain. Were there moments when this could have been stopped? Did silence accelerate what confrontation might have prevented? And how many families, famous or not, are walking the same line without realizing how close they are to the edge? The headlines may fade, but the lesson doesn't. This wasn't just a Hollywood scandal, it was a reminder that unspoken fear can be as destructive as open anger, and that sometimes the most devastating collapses happen quietly, behind closed doors. If you want to stay connected to stories that go deeper than the headlines, consider subscribing for more thoughtful investigations like this.